Hi, everyone. This week we're going to be covering the 17th century, and a lot happened. So let's go ahead and jump right in. This is going to be our 17th century timeline. I'm going to go over some of the more significant, moments in history. But just kind of thinking about how we begin and end this time period. Elizabeth I is going to die in 1603, and James I will ascend. He's coming from Scotland. Um, and in 1688, we're going to have the Glorious Revolution. That's when James II flees to France, and his daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange take over the monarchy. A lot is going to happen in the meantime, so let's get into that. So the gunpowder plot, this is something you might have heard of talked about before, especially if you've heard of Guy Fawkes. Um, and there's those famous Guy Fawkes masks. So basically, what happened here is that when James I took over the throne of England, a lot of Catholics were hopeful that this would mean that finally all of the anti-Catholic hostility would end, or at least it would be lessened. And instead, what happened was it was maintained by James I. And so some Catholic conspirators got together and they decided that they were going to assassinate James I and try to put his youngest daughter in charge of England. And so what they did was they got a bunch of gunpowder and they put it beneath Parliament. James I and some of his family were supposed to go to Parliament. And basically, Guy Fawkes was caught in the act. They took him and co-conspirators to the Tower of London, tortured them, brutally executed them. And there's details of that that are very not good if you're squeamish. And so now there's Guy Fawkes Day, November 5th, and it's sort of this like folk demon day where they build these like dolls and burn them down and everything. It's a whole thing. So if you're curious to learn more about that, I have a link there. The other major event, and this is going to happen much later, is going to be the English Revolution or the Civil War. And so basically, we have these new kings coming in, the Stuarts, right? The Tudor era ended with England, with Elizabeth I. And now James I and Charles I, both of them, they came from Scotland. They have this sort of different politics, right? They're not used to serving to ruling with Parliament. They have this idea of the king, his power being God-given. And so sort of this idea that they should have like a lot of power and they shouldn't have to share rule because God has given them that power, right? And long story short, this doesn't end up being very popular. Charles I, in fact, he tries to just rule without Parliament. He dismisses Parliament and doesn't allow them to reconvene for about a decade. And you can imagine that's building a lot of hostility. Parliament is supposed to be in charge of things like taxes, and Charles I has been issuing his own taxes. There's just a lot of, which are, considered illegal. There's a lot of tension. Finally, Charles I realizes he needs Parliament's help to get more money. He lets them convene again, but it's already kind of done at that point. A civil war breaks out between the King's army and the Parliament army, which is much larger and stronger. Parliament also has much more money. And so nobles start leaving Charles I. He starts losing more and more of his support, and eventually he is beheaded in a public execution in 1649, essentially ending England's monarchy, right? After having two kings in a row who acted this way, like they didn't need to share power and that they could do whatever they wanted because God gave them the right, England kind of seemed to decide that they didn't really need a king. And so they declare Oliver Cromwell, this is Parliament, so it's not based on bloodline, they declare him the Lord Protector. And so he's not a king, but he does have this leadership role. It is not super long lasting. He dies, and when he dies, they sort of try to make his son the Lord Protector. It doesn't really work out. Um, and eventually, Charles II is actually invited to return to England, leaving his exile, and he is established as the King of England in 1660. Now, you would think that this would mean Charles II would have learned some valuable lessons, but in In a surprising, shocking turn, he tries to rule without Parliament, and because Parliament holds the purse strings, right? He actually makes a secret deal with the King of France at the time to get a secret pension, and so he's actually getting funded by France, and so it's allowing him to rule without the Parliament. Eventually, James II takes the throne. I believe this is Charles's brother, but it's like hard. They all have the same name. And that's in 1685. Um, again, you'd think some of these kings would read the history books or something. So he was married to a Protestant woman, but then when she died, he remarried a Catholic woman. And remember, this is a very anti-Catholic time period in England. He starts ignoring Protestant laws that have been established by Parliament. He's placing generals and stuff who are Catholic, and he's not making them swear allegiance to the Church of England, which is against the laws Parliament has set up. It's very unpopular. Long story short, he is exiled, and his daughter Mary comes in with her husband, um, William of Orange, and they take the throne in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And that's kind of what we consider the end of this time period. It's obviously not the end of the 17th century officially, right? Um, but in terms of kind of categorizing this literary time period, that is what we consider the end. All right, so a couple of other things are happening in this time. One is the Great Plague of London. And so, and let me move my face so you can see the scary mask. This was, a mask that doctors would wear when treating patients with the bubonic plague. You can learn more about the bubonic plague. I've included some links. You can also learn more about the Black Death in England and in Europe in the 14th century, which is another case of bubonic plague. Basically, this is completely devastating. This happens in September of 1665 and lasts about 18 months. And there's differing numbers of how severe of an effect this has because we're not 100% sure of the population of London at the time, but it's estimated between 15 to 25% of the population dies from the bubonic plague. In this time period. And look, there had been bubonic plague before, like, not even just in the 14th century, but even within this time period that we have just described, 1603 until this current time. But this was just such a devastating pandemic that it's the one that we refer to as the Great Plague. Oops. All right. Unluckily, the next year, London experienced another huge disaster, which was the Great Fire of London. This started in September of 1666, September 2nd, and it was mostly contained by the 5th of September, but more than half of London was destroyed. 13,000 homes, 87 parishes, St. Paul's Cathedral, they're all burned down. And the estimated loss from this fire is kind of unfathomable. It was, I mean, now it doesn't necessarily sound that way. It's 10 million pounds, right? That's, there's people who have 10 million pounds, right? But at the time, London's annual income, and London was, like a bustling, like wealth, gaining in wealth place, was about 12,000 pounds. So this is so much more than that, that they've lost. And there was the way that they were able to contain the fire was by destroying more homes to kind of like create a barricade. And so it was just so unbelievably devastating. And it's kind of interesting to read about it too, because for a long time people were in denial. They were like, oh, this fire is not that big of a deal. And then it's like the next thing you know, all of London is gone. So anyway, if you're curious to learn more about that, there's some links here, including a diary of someone who lived at the time who wrote about this from firsthand experience. All right, so let's get into the readings for this week. Our first writer this week is John Donne. He was born in 1572 and lived to 1631. He was raised Catholic. So, like we've been talking, there's a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment. His Catholicism is going to be holding him back throughout his life. He studied law at Oxford, but he wasn't allowed to get a law degree. He eventually converts to Anglicanism in the 1590s. And frankly, we just can't really know if that was because of some sort of like actual desire of him that was inside of himself and his spiritual journey, or if he really just kind of had to convert because he didn't have a lot of opportunities. He was suffering. He wasn't able to get the kind of good work that he wanted because of his religion. Okay, so he ends up getting a pretty good job now that he's converted. And he sort of spoils everything by he marries his employer's 17-year-old niece, Anne. And look, they are married her whole life. They have 12 children together, including, a lot of children who don't survive. So those are their children who survive. Um, and she dies at 33. Um, but this sort of ruins his career that he does this. His employer it's a complete scandal, and his name is sort of ruined. Eventually, he actually becomes an Anglican priest. So again, it's kind of unclear how much choice he had in the matter. It sounds like there was a lot of pressure on him from people in high positions, including royalty, to become a priest. And so this was what ended up being the end of his life. He has 160 sermons that have been preserved, including one that we read this week. He preached in his own funeral. He preached his own funeral sermon, right? He was sick, he was dying. He preached his own sermon, and then he actually got a portrait made of him in his shroud, which I included here because I just think it's very interesting and maybe not surprising after we've read some of his poems. So he's probably most famous for his metaphysical poems, and he's sort of considered the, I don't know if father is the right word, but he sort of started this movement of metaphysical poetry in England at this time. And his most famous poems are probably his erotic medical metaphysical poems. So for example, the flea, I would not normally think of a flea being an erotic associated with that. But it was a popular symbol in European poetry at the time because people thought that Ovid had written a poem about a flea. And this flea, this idea of, sort of a flea drinking blood, and the way that that was related to, erotic activities or whatever. So we see here, Donne is making this argument about the flea. The flea drinks the woman's blood and then drinks his blood, and their blood is already intermingled inside this flea. So what's the harm of them having sex, right? And so that's kind of the argument here. He's making a sort of argument to her. Um, Later, they find out it wasn't Ovid who wrote this poem, by the way. But we have some poems in this time period, and they're influenced by this, a belief that Ovid had written it. So Donne's poetry is going to be hard to nail down in terms of meter. We can look at this one and say, okay, well, this one is, you know, written in iambic tetrameter and pentameter, and we have the rhyme scheme A, A, B, B, C, C, D, D, D. So I can talk about it. Some of his poems are much harder to sort of classify. And then another thing I wanted to make sure that you talked about, or that we talked about this week, is this idea of a conceit. This is an unconventional, logically complex, or surprising metaphor. All right. And so, um, think of metaphors that don't, when we think of we've seen these a little bit, I think, with Petrarchan poetry. What's interesting is with Donne, we're going to see this in a more metaphysical level. So he's going to fuse the sensory and the abstract, trading on the element of surprise and unlikeness to hold the reader's attention. Okay. And so, again, sensory and abstract. There's going to be things that are very like physical, um, realistic, even mundane. And then those are going to be connected to these like grand ideas, and spiritual concepts and things like that. Okay. His other poem in this category is the Ecstasy. Ecstasis is a word from Greek that means a movement of the soul outside the body. And we have this like pretty literally here, right? We have these two lovers who are holding hands, and at the same time their souls are commingling, right? And in my million-year-old Norton anthology, I have the words written next to this: anti-Petrarchan Neoplatonic heresy. And that must have been words that my professor said, because I don't think I would have I don't think I would have thought of that. So I love this quote from Poem Analysis. It says, "The union of bodies is as essential as the union of souls. Thus, Donne goes against the teachings of both Plato and the Christian divines in his stresses on sensuous and physical basis, even of spiritual love." And if we're thinking back to um, the discussion of these women mystics, right? And I was telling you about how women weren't really supposed to write about spiritual stuff, like religious stuff, because they were associated with the body. And there's this whole idea of a separation between body and soul. And Donne is really questioning that duality, right? And he seems to see things as being much more intermingled and complex, and how these two things work together. Okay. So moving on to his other metaphysical poems, we have a valediction forbidding mourning. This, a valediction, just so you know, is a farewell poem. And this one is going to have one of the more famous conceits from Donne. This is a great poem, but I wanted to point out the conceit specifically. And it's this compass, right? Here is the quote from SparkNotes. It says, "The speaker then declares that since the lovers' two souls are one, his departure will simply expand the area of their unified soul, rather than cause a rift between them. If, however, their souls are two instead of one, they are as the feet of a drafter's compass, connected with the center of with the center foot fixing the orbit of the outer foot and helping it to describe a perfect circle." Okay, so the idea is that when they separate, he has to leave her, right? And it's just the area of their souls is going to expand. But then he's saying, even if they do split up, they are still connected at the center by by the feet of they're both feet of the drafter's compass. And so there's still this thing in the middle connecting them. They're never fully separated. Um, and just kind of this beautiful idea of a spiritual connection between two people, even if they're physically apart. The canonization, this is referring to canonization is describing the process of becoming a saint, being named a saint. And so it's interesting to see that word being used to describe a romantic relationship. And here, Donne is writing a poem, seemingly kind of, it's like he's coming in hot, right? Maybe like a young person has criticized his romantic relationship or something. And he's sort of defensive, right? He's coming in, like I said, coming in hot. And there's some great conceits here. There's imagery of birds of prey and other birds, including, I think, most profoundly, like a phoenix. And again, these are going to be conceits are going to be these sustained metaphors that are sort of, they don't quite, it's like very different types of things, right? And so that's what I wanted to point out from this. I also just like this poem because I think it really shows how funny he is. And so the wittiness really comes through, I think, in the canonization and the flea, especially. So another thing I wanted to mention, though, is a note on the word dying. And I had my English professor tell me this when I was in English survey class reading Donne, is that when he's referring to dying, it's just important to keep in mind that dying is another double entendre. And so, did I talk about double entendre before? No. Okay. I'm going to talk about it later. It's a double entendre, meaning that it can mean death, literally, but it can also be referring to like a sexual climax. Okay. And so it does mean both. And so just kind of keep that in mind. If you're reading some of these poems and you're like, wow, they're talking about death a lot. This is so dark. I thought this was a love poem. It's just something to kind of think about. Okay. The Holy Sonnets. So he wrote 19 poems that are sort of about like a Jesuit or Protestant meditative practice. So these are like his deeply religious poems. And it's kind of funny to transition from talking about, especially his erotic poetry, but his metaphysical poetry that is like more, associated with like a day-to-day life, and then his religious poems. Although I think he would argue probably that these things are not so separate, right? So Holy Sonnet 10, this is going to be written in iambic pentameter. Yes. 1 meter. It's going to be our ABBA ABBA C D D C E E. So based on like an English sonnet form. Here we have death personified and given a talking to, right? So again, he's coming in kind of hot. There's like a sassiness to Donne that I think is really fun. But basically, like he's saying death is, he's talking directly to death. Death is personified. Death is the person he's speaking to. And he's saying like, you're so self-absorbed or whatever, you think I'm scared of you, you're gonna die. How about that? And so I'm like obviously way oversimplifying, but we can see how here he is not scared of death because presumably he has this faith in spiritual afterlife through his Christianity. In and here I'm looking at this Holy Sonnet 14. I'm like, what are those numbers again? Okay. This one is describing a crisis of faith, right? There's a lot of darkness, I think, in this poem. There's a lot of struggle, like internal struggle in this poem. And why I wanted you to read this is because I think this is a really good example of the way that his eroticism, like that kind of like those kinds of poems that he that are very much like of the body, they are also so spiritual. And so here he is talking about his spiritual connection with God and how it's being threatened by his like earthly distractions or whatever. And in asking for God's help, he's asking for God to sort of have this. He describes it as being ravished. He wants God to ravish him. Um, and ravish, it translates to rape. And so it is like a very violent, erotic image. And it's just kind of, I mean, it's like a very dark, it's hard to talk about that in a way without it having that dark meaning. But I think that what Donne might be doing here is kind of making a connection between something that is so overwhelmingly passionate, like a love for God, right? Something that it can't really um, be described in like a moderate terms necessarily, right? And then thinking about that, how that translates into a more erotic relationship. And he's not the first one to do this, by the way. We even had this with I'm blanking on her name, but our female mystics, right? Marjorie Kemp, for example, I think is a good example of someone else who has made those sorts of comparisons and connections. Okay, we're going to move. We're going to move in a really different direction now. We're going to talk about Aemilia Lanyer. So she was born in 1569 and lived until 1645, a good long life. She was the daughter of a court musician, and he actually died when she was 7, but she maintained connections to the court after his death. And so we're going to see how that translates into her life. At 18, she becomes the mistress of Elizabeth I, Lord Chamberlain, who was 45 years her senior. And despite that age gap, it seems like she actually does have like a fondness for that relationship. She becomes pregnant with the Lord Chamberlain, and I don't remember his name, his baby. And she's his mistress. She is not in a position to marry him. So she is hurriedly married to Alfonso Lanyer. She does not seem to like that she is being forced to marry somebody. He's another court musician. And yeah, she seems resentful of it. They have, they raise kids together. They have kids too together. Much of what we know about her biography, this is so interesting to me. It actually comes from her astrologist, Simon Forman, in his diary. And Forman like has a crush on her. He writes about the things that he's like analyzed from her life and like his meetings with her and things like that. And so we get a little bit of detail because potentially just because he thinks that she's interesting, in part because he has a crush on her, or however you would say that. He makes a pass at her actually, and she is nice about it, but does not, it sounds like it doesn't happen. Um, and then the other thing that I want to point out about Lanyer is that there have been people in the past who have argued that she was Shakespeare's Dark Lady. And apparently, if you remember from the sonnet sequence, and apparently that was taken so for granted as being true that you can get, like, I was looking up Aemilia Lanyer books before. She only published one volume, and we're going to talk about it in a second, of poems. But if you look her up, I think the book that overwhelmingly was popping up on my Google was The Poems of Shakespeare's Dark Lady. And then her name is like really teeny tiny on there. And I get it. Maybe they're just trying to move some books, and Shakespeare is, so famous that maybe he can move books. But the point I want to make is that there's not great evidence, as far as I can tell, that she was Shakespeare's Dark Lady. The man who originally made this claim, he had misread the Simon Forman's diary and interpreted it in a way to kind of suggest that she's the Dark Lady. There's evidence. It's possible. I wouldn't take it for granted. And the thing is that if you associate her with Shakespeare, Shakespeare is just so famous that it kind of takes away her own success in poetry. And so I think a lot of people would prefer to remove that potential theory, like conspiracy or whatever, that she is the Dark Lady because she was a successful poet in her own right. And, you know, it seems like based on her poetry, she might not love being completely overshadowed by Shakespeare. Okay, so and I'm going to completely butcher the pronunciation here, but Salve Deus Rex Eudorum. So when she publishes this, she becomes the first woman to publish a book of poems in English, and she's also the first woman who's really doing like patronage in this way, where she's publishing these poems. They are written to patrons, sort of asking for support, praising these patrons, and all this stuff. It's kind of an exciting fact about her, right? So the title here, it's going to translate to Hail God, King of the Jews. This is going to be like a very religious text. It's 1,840 lines in ottava rima, which is iambic pentameter stanzas. And so again, we have that iambic pentameter. It's so easy to read. I love it. But it is going to be a little bit interesting. We have a stanza of 11 syllable lines, and a rhyme scheme of ABA, BAB, CC. If you're curious about learning more about it, I think we're going to read another one soon. But this is a unique form of poetry. It's pretty cool, but it is yeah, iambic pentameter. So I think that may be more interesting than the history or the form of this poem is really the sort of proto-feminism. I don't even know if I would call it that. I would probably just say feminism, even if it's a different form than what we would think of. She's addressing this woman question, okay? And I have it in the French here, but so feel free to click that link if you want to learn more. But basically, there's this debate going on, especially as we're getting more and more of a sense of like individualism, and especially into the Renaissance, these questions of, man's relationship with God and how that is on the individual level, moving more and more towards individualism and against the sense of like, you know, not individualism, I guess is the way I would say it. Okay, so based on this, there's a lot of people who are starting to believe, well, the women should have more, agency. We should be kind of questioning the way that women are treated. There's questions about, are women inferior to men? Is it because men are stronger? Is it because blah, blah, blah? But remember, a lot of stuff is going to be based on religious reasoning at this point. And so a lot of people who are arguing that women are inferior to men are going to be using the Bible as evidence. And specifically, they're going to be using Eve's tempting of Adam in the Garden of Eden to when she tempts him to eat this forbidden fruit, the original sin is Eve's fault. Okay? That's the argument. And we're going to potentially get this argument changing and moving more into being scientific and about how women are less strong and whatever. And that's why they're inferior. But at this point, it really is going to be based on this kind of religious philosophy. And what's interesting then is that this sets apart Lanyer's poems even more and her writings even more. It says, this is from the Poetry Foundation, for a woman to write authoritatively on so sacred a subject is unusual, but for her to revise 1,500 years of traditional commentary in the process is unheard of, right? Her poetry collection starts with personal references and has a strong polemic thrust, attacking the vanity and blindness of men and justifying women's right to be free of masculine subjugation, right? So she's writing like in defense of Eve and of women. She's using examples of Pilate's wife who begged Pilate to leave Jesus alone. She's like she's sort of doing like a historical revision here of saying, okay, actually, wasn't Adam supposed to be stronger than Eve? Well, then why was he so tempted? Isn't he worse than her because he was actually tempted when he's supposed to be stronger than her or whatever? Okay, so she's trying to make these arguments and change this conversation, and it's just really interesting. And honestly, too, it's interesting because at this time, and this is her only book of poetry that's published, and there's some speculation that maybe that's because this was kind of a hostile time period for women with, I mean, if you're thinking of James I writing a book on witch hunting, I mean, it's not a great time to be a woman who's writing something that's like religiously, could be considered heresy, right? And so, um, And so she's very brave, I think, in writing this. All right, we're going to talk about our final writer then, Andrew Marvell. He's born in 1621, so quite a bit later than our previous writers, lived until 1678. He's the son of a Calvinist minister, and that's important because even though England was Protestant at the time, remember that they are following the Church of England, and that is like an official, very official, legal um, monarchy supported or parliament supported institution. And so Calvinism is going to be a type of Protestantism different than the Church of England. And so there was a lot of attempts to make sure that people who are practicing religion are using the Church of England's books and they're doing things the way that the Church of England considers correct. And so even if you do have like some different religious philosophies like Calvinism or other Puritan kind of faith differences. You could be persecuted, and that could be pretty severe. It was definitely like a significant difference. So I wanted to point that out. He did study at Cambridge, and he didn't finish his degree, but he studied art. And yeah. And then he's known for satire as well as love poetry. So his works, we typically talk about them as being sort of pre-restoration of the monarchy and post-restoration of the monarchy, with his love poems, not unlike a lot of our other male poets, tending to happen earlier on, and then his satire comes a little bit later on in life. Okay, so the poem we're going to be looking at today, and we could look at other poems from him, but I really wanted us to focus on what I think is his most famous poem, and is connected to Donne, is To His Coy Mistress. And so this is another metaphysical erotic poem, very influenced by Donne on the theme of carpe diem, YOLO, in other words, right? He is arguing that life is short, that the woman that he likes or loves or whatever should might as well just they should just have sex, right? The tone is witty, it's ironic. He's using a lot of exaggerated kind of offers and claims that are creating a parody of Petrarchan love poems, right? You know, when they're comparing the mistress to the sun or whatever, and he's making these huge claims and offers and things like that too, offering to love her from before the flood of Noah to up to the apocalypse. You know, these kinds of like extreme offers but they're kind of like, you know, parodying, so like kind of making fun of those Petrarchan conceits. Let's see. There's also some lewd wordplay here, and this is what I was talking about with that double entendre. He uses the word quaint, but keep in mind that this is a play on words. It can mean out of date, but it can also be a word for genitals. So, you know, again, there's like a it's not subtle sometimes, the eroticism of these poems, even if it might feel like it to us, right? But it is clever, you know, so it's not totally crass. It's written in iambic tetrameter. So again, we have kind of a nice meter here. We have rhyming couplets. Those tend to be very easy on the ear, right? In other words, you know, two lines, they rhyme, the next two lines rhyme, the next two lines rhyme. So A, A, B, B, C, C, D, D pattern. And then there's some great conceits in here. Really, really great. I love vegetables of love. This idea of your love growing like vegetables. Chariots of time, this like racing chariot coming towards you, signifying like, you know, the loss of time. And then most disturbingly, I think this idea of worms feeding on a woman, and maybe like conceptually on her virginity. She's died without having lost her virginity as she lies buried in her grave, right? So that is like quite a dark image, but he makes it sound so funny, and exaggerated that I think it still ends up. There's like a weight to it, obviously, but maybe not so much darkness. We're going to end there. I hope that you can see the connections, how this relates back to Donne, the ways that, you know, these men are writing to women, is interesting. It might kind of help us think through the way women were treated and talked to at this time. And then especially learning about Aemilia Lanyer, who was a mistress, of someone, you know, so connected to royalty. And and then wrote these like incredible defenses of the way women are viewed. There's just a lot to unpack here, a lot to analyze. I tried to give you some places to start, but I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say. All right, have a great week. I will see you next time.